First, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge that the land that we are on have been inhabited by Indigenous peoples for millennia. As Canadians, we are thankful for the opportunity to live, work, and play here. We honor and uphold the first environmental agreement, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We thank those who have served and continue to share as stewards of this special place. Thank you so much, Dr. Baird, for joining us for this eCampus interview on sustainable communities. Throughout the course, students have learned key concepts related to sustainable communities, including monitoring and evaluation. As a Canadian Research Chair in Human Dimensions of Water Resources and Water Resilience, we are so looking forward to hearing your experience and perspectives on collaboration and engagement on this topic. Before we begin, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about the project?
Yeah, sure, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to connect with you and to share a little bit about the work that I do, and specifically on this project. So as you mentioned, I'm a Canada Research Chair in Human Dimensions of Water Resources and Water Resilience, and that means that I have a keen interest in how decision-making happens and how actions happen in relation to our ecosystems, and in particular water. But my research interests more broadly are around decision-making, whether it's at a group level or at an individual level. And this project was particularly interesting for me as a social scientist because we do a lot of ecological evaluations using people as our source of information. And there's been some discussion in the literature ongoing about whether or not that's an appropriate way of assessing ecosystems. And so this project, which looked at a variety of ways of assessing an ecosystem, was really kind of personally interesting, but we think also makes a nice contribution to ongoing discussions in the literature and also practice, how people actually do this stuff in the real world.
Amazing, thank you so much. I'd like to start off with asking you why, in your opinion, is monitoring and evaluation an essential component of building sustainable communities?
So when we're making decisions about how we govern our ecosystems, it's important to know something about the actions that we've already taken and the actions that we're planning to take in order to achieve our objectives, and usually those objectives hopefully include some sort of sustainability element to them. And so it's important to understand whether or not we're actually moving towards those objectives. And without monitoring and evaluating the work that we've already done and putting in place ways that we're going to monitor and evaluate the actions that we're going to take in the future, we don't know if those actions are actually leading towards achieving those objectives. And so, you know, this idea of being adaptive and shifting how we do things depending on the current situation, it's imperative to have some sort of monitoring and evaluation process in place, and that needs to be ongoing. That's really important, and it doesn't happen as much as it should. So a big part of the impetus for this project was to look at alternatives to kind of the standard way that we collect environmental or ecosystem monitoring and evaluation data, which is, you know, sending somebody with specific expertise out into the field and you know, doing their assessment and providing a report. We thought that, you know, there's lots of exploration in the literature, and there's increasing evidence that this is happening in practice, that you can engage your community in doing these sorts of activities, and that there may be benefits beyond just collecting data, that there might be broader benefits to the community as well. So it was really an exciting question to ask and an exciting research design.
Amazing, yeah, I totally agree. So yourself and other Brock researchers at the Environmental Sustainability Research Center, in partnership with Niagara Parks Commission, received a SSHRC Insight Development Grant to investigate a project on how alternative methods for ecological assessment compare to expert evaluation. And your findings were recently published in the Journal of Environmental Management. I'm wondering, you touched on it a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could describe what was the motivation for looking at this important topic, and then also describe the project in a bit more detail.
Yeah, so I mean, there were really two main motivations. One was quite scholarly and research oriented, where we were interested in, this approach that we've actually been using in the past already. We've published kind of our stakeholder or community-based assessments in other projects, and there was discussion around how reliable or how valid those assessments were. And so it was a kind of a personal research interest, certainly, but also a very practical motivation in that we understand that monitoring and evaluation isn't happening as much as it maybe should or could be. And so understanding what are those trade-offs, or how comparable are different approaches to monitoring and evaluation as compared to that more kind of standard expert going into the field providing a report kind of approach. Yeah, so there were multiple reasons why we did it, and having Niagara Parks Commission as a partner in this made this project possible, and just really grateful that that was possible.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of your results, were you surprised by what you found?
So there were some things that were interesting. We compared 4 approaches. So there was kind of our standard expert in the field approach. There was a community science-based approach where people had some training and then went out into the field and had quite a bit of guidance in terms of how they did their assessment. We had a third approach that used also community members, but with much less guidance. We called it more of like a site visitor assessment, somebody who might casually visit a site and answer a few questions if we're thinking about it in practical terms. And then we also included a remote sensing component as well. So we asked them to do 3 levels of assessment, from very broad kind of site-based assessments down to species level densities or abundance, and assessments of vegetation health and that sort of thing. And this was done in a grassland restoration site that Niagara Parks Commission developed quite a few years ago. And so, I mean, what was great and what didn't really surprise me was that at that broadest level, we had both community-based approaches and the expert approach very much in agreement on kind of the assessment level of that site. What did surprise me was that as we got into the finer details, there was really a big difference between what the expert who went out into the field was able to identify in terms of the variety of species and what the other approaches were able to find, including remote sensing. So I guess, this is a pilot study. It was done for 1 year at one site, and I certainly don't want to extrapolate this too far into all situations, but certainly the indications from this study are that if you're doing broader assessments, that it actually might be just as good to use a community given some guidance as it is to send an expert out into the field and do that assessment. So from a research perspective, that was really exciting. And I think, in terms of practice and what that means for organizations like the Niagara Parks Commission, but certainly not limited to them, is that there is some potential for engaging the community in these sorts of approaches too. The other thing that was really exciting and we didn't ask for but got anyway, which is maybe another surprise, is the positive feedback that we got from community members who were engaged in the research project. All sorts of comments that told us that they were personally benefiting from being out in the field and doing these assessments. So that tells us that even though we weren't looking at benefits beyond collecting, monitoring, and evaluation data, that those benefits were there. And so that's something that I would be very interested in kind of digging into further, exactly what that means for those who participate in these sorts of approaches.
Yeah, that's so interesting, 100%. So a follow-up to that, and maybe a little bit more specifically, based on your experience, what can we say about the reliability of citizen science data, and how does it compare to those more conventional approaches?
Yeah, so I mean, again, this is a pilot study over 1 year in one place. So what we can say from this study is that at that broad level, we have a pretty reasonable ability, regardless of approach, to collect an assessment that's going to align with what an expert would tell us, using community members as our data collectors and our assessors. I think, from the literature, we know that there's a wide range of abilities out there, and depending on your specific objectives, it may really, you may get very different results. But certainly we saw some potential here, and that was very exciting. I think when you get down to the species level, where you're very interested in very specific information, it may be more challenging to bring community in, but again, it depends on the particular objectives of the project, and also on I think your ability to train and prepare community members for going out and collecting the data too.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insight and experience. I loved hearing more about the project, and I'm really looking forward to reading the paper.
Yeah, thank you.